I think a lot of material about Lindauer's career and how he did things was forgotten. The fact that he was a photographer was denied in the 1970s, and someone who actually knew him as a child came out and said, no, I have photographs he took, but nobody's really looked into it until now. But the other thing, in terms of the technical understanding, it's come through research by people like Sarah into his materials and techniques using analytical tools, using infrared photography and analysis. So that's one thread to it, but the other thread is through historical research, so looking for primary documents like the notebook. Lindauer did his training in Vienna at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and he went there in 1855 as a 16-year-old. It's not sure whether he trained in the academy itself or under one of the teachers there, and he was very influenced by the Nazarene approach to painting, which is very translucent paintwork, very white ground and quite sort of bright work. After his training was completed, he went back to Pilsen, where he's from, and started a portrait painting business. And his works from about 1870, 1872 show him starting to use photography.
I was doing some research into Lindauer's technique, looking at various Lindauers around the country, and I noticed that this particular painting that the Turnbull Library had recently acquired looked unusual. It lacked the convincing three-dimensional effects and photographic quality of a Lindauer painting that I was used to. The alignment of the canvas wasn't completely square, the paint was applied unevenly, it was sort of thick in some areas and thinner in other areas. We didn't know whether it was a forgery or whether it was just an unusual work. It's very difficult to determine forgeries, and it really relies on you having a lot of knowledge about the artist's work and being very familiar with their practice. You have to look at it as a whole picture. You'll first of all look at it standing back, then you will examine it perhaps with ultraviolet or infrared, which enable you to see the surface changes or beneath the surface slightly. And then you'll start looking at the structure. How is the canvas prepared? You'll look at it through the microscope. You might even take a cross-section like we did with the Turnbull work, and look at the layering of the paint. The really concrete piece of evidence that we found was that when we examined the cross-section under ultraviolet light, the ground layer fluoresced a sort of dark purple colour, whereas a lead white ground layer that you would find on a Lindauer painting would generally be quite bright and fluorescent. Raman spectroscopy identified the pigment in the ground layer as being the rutile form of titanium dioxide, which was only available as a pigment from 1941, many years after Lindauer died. And we made sure it was in an area that wasn't restored, so that was the final crunch. But there were various other things wrong with the painting as well. When you looked from the microscopic level, it was much more opaque, the paint work was much more loosely applied, and yeah, it was just, there were too many uncharacteristic features. Lindauer's process for painting on canvas seems to be that he projected a photographic image using a glass plate positive with a light source behind it, and this was projected onto the canvas, and then he drew an outline. So he tends to draw around features around the projection rather than sketching something up. When we've looked at forgeries, we don't see that sort of feature. So he obviously had a real technique for what was important. So the next stage, which is here, is when the dark shadows are brushed in, and also the highlights will be done. Everything's done fairly transparently because he wants to keep the ground glowing through the paint, followed by the halftones, and so it's pulling the whole image together. And yet in this bit of the eye, the glazes have yet to be applied. So the glazes create the three-dimensional effect. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the copal oil resin that we think Lindauer used. But I've got some other sort of medium. And it's just got to remain transparent so that it causes darkening, but it doesn't, you can still see through it.
With a painting like this, you've got a sketch underneath that the artist has drawn, and then over that he's laid over the painting. With a painted photograph, what Lindauer calls a bromide, you have a thin layer of paper that's adhered to board usually, which has the paint applied over the top of it. So there's no drawing underneath. The drawing is effectively the photograph. He sold them for less, I guess, for people who wanted to have a less expensive portrait.
So again, he's using the image to locate all the features on the face, but then the rest of it is all invented and the entire image is covered. It's very hard to see any evidence of the photographic emulsion. The difference is that when you look very closely at the painting, you can see little voids in the paint and see the ground through those little voids, and these paintings tend to get little cracks in the surface because the oil doesn't stick so well to the albumin or gelatin.
You can almost see the darkness of the photograph underneath coming through. The colour is applied rather than intrinsic. So in a painting like this, the colour looks like it's part of the form, whereas in a painted photograph it looks like it's been applied to the form, is how I sometimes see it. There's the portrait of Beatrix Bolton that's in this exhibition. I think really the colour, she looks like she's got the vibrant auburn hair and the velvet dress is very well done, and to me really comes across.
Being able to find actual examples of his glass plate negatives or his cabinet cards, that gives you a lot more information.
Well, these are a series of glass plate negatives, and we also have a photographic album as well from the Lindauer family, which has some examples in there of the albumin prints that he would make. We also have a cabinet card, which is very nice because it has Lindauer's name underneath.
But we're also aware that in his notebook he refers to the numerous quantities of eggs that he used, which would seem to imply that they were albumin prints.
Sometimes Lindauer is written off for using photographs, but it was very common. And when photography was invented, a painter called Paul Delaroche said, painting is dead. While photography was this wonderful new innovation, it didn't allow colour, and it was also very small in scale. He realised that people liked the photographic look, but they wanted something that looked very real and like the person that was being portrayed, but they wanted it at life size, and they also wanted the colour, and that's one of the things that he was able to bring.
The people often just look more radiant, and he's got rid of all the nasty defects in many ways. Being able to use photography made sense. It was a new technology. It accurately located things, why not use it?
Portraiture changed quite a lot as a result of photography. The paintings became much more painterly on the whole, and with avant-garde sort of moved in a different direction. But in New Zealand the taste was still very much for the photographic, but in colour.
Trying to make very realistic portraits, he limited his palette because he'd worked out a way of doing it using these particular colours. So that is another key for us. If we see other colours introduced in paintings, we tend to, alarm bells start ringing.
Well, I think the other thing about his palette that's interesting is that I think it reflects the sober nature of society at the time, that people wanted the portraits as a status object, but they didn't want them to be ostentatious. And I think maybe the palette is reflecting that as well.
Many of the colours are very similar to someone like Charles Frederick Goldie.
Goldie is a generation younger than Lindauer, but their careers did overlap. So Goldie painted his first portrait in 1892, but he then went overseas to France to train, and he came back to New Zealand at the end of the 19th century and showed his first Māori portraits, a big group of Māori portraits in 1900. Lindauer used the pencil underdrawing, whereas Goldie tended to work with charcoal and then apply the paint afterwards. And Sarah Hillary, through her work, has found that he also square it up and then use that to transfer it onto the canvas. So he used photographs more as a visual aid.
Well, if we hadn't done all the research and looked at all these paintings and spent a lot of time looking at them in detail and comparing and we would never learn all this information. We would still be back years ago when we sort of looked at these non-characteristic paintings and thought they looked like Lindauer on a bad day. And we were never able to say conclusively that they were or weren't. So we've learnt a huge amount from examining paintings that are under question. It's made us really look at what is Lindauer's techniques.